Good evening and welcome to everyone. It's nice to have you join us here for the story of Chatham Marconi, the story of community commitment and perseverance that Liz McCart and I, with the help of Ron Farris, have been exploring for the last few months. I want to share with you a little bit of how that has happened, because originally in January or so, this event was on the schedule as a regular summer speaker series Thursday night event. And at the time, we knew our anniversary was coming and we wanted to do something, but we really hadn't figured out what the something was going to be. So Liz and I started talking to people, many of whom are sitting at the table before you. And we kept finding out new and interesting things. And what this project has turned into from a single evening event is a larger continuing oral history program that we have a number of other ideas in mind and are looking for some grant funding to support the project going forward, because those of us who've had the opportunity to learn about how Chatham Marconi came to be know what a good story it is. And like any good story, it has some interesting characters and some challenges and some creative activities and some perseverance and maybe a little stubbornness thrown in, and all of that helped. And it got it done in ways that nobody could have anticipated. And I hope that you'll really enjoy the story as much as we have. Tonight is really about the memories and the opportunity to share with the people who were in the room when it happened what the beginnings of Chatham Marconi really were like. So I want to introduce to you this panel, and it is a group of people who have contributed in a variety of ways. They were founders, they were developers, they have been board members, now board members emeritus. The accomplishments that they share and that they continue with their volunteer time is really quite amazing. And just as an aside, we have probably at least that same number of people lined up to talk to as we move forward. So we'll continue to communicate with people and find out what their stories are. And every time we do, we learn 3 or 4 more people that we need to talk to. So the story continues. The panel from your left: John Cottenham, Barbara Cottenham, Bob Ryder, Mairead Sullivan, Roz Coleman, Chuck Bartlett, Betty Magnuson, Reed Moffett, and Jane Moffett. And as I said, they were all there at the beginning. And not only was Mairead there at the beginning in the room where it happened, it was her room. She's the only person on the panel who was not a director of the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center, but she is the founder of the Friends of Forest Beach and has a story to tell that really started this whole process, and in ways that were creative and persistent and successful. So I'm going to turn it over to Mairead.
Thank you. My husband and I owned a cottage in South Chatham, and it was just a short walk up to the RCA MCI property. And in the winter of 1998, it was pretty quiet up there. So we, would walk up there, and it was all abandoned, and the views were amazing, even though there were 100 telephone poles and wires and a 300-foot tower. We really didn't understand what any of that was about. But we just knew with the abandoned buildings that there was a clock ticking somewhere, and we didn't want to be in a position where we would be reacting to somebody else's plan, because we had what we thought would be a good plan for the property, which of course was, from us, preservation, conservation, clean it up, and have people enjoy these magnificent views. And it would be one of those places that endears all of us to Cape Cod, those places that you can just go and enjoy the nature. So we started to take some action. We were calling the town, we weren't getting answers back. We tried calling MCI, nobody answered the phone. And, it really was, getting to us, we wanted to do something. So we then noticed that one of the selectmen, Tom Bernardo, had office hours for 2 hours a week. So we figured, well, we'll go and talk to him, because first of all, if the town had something going on, we wanted to know what it was. We didn't want to be, creating a problem. And if they didn't have something going on, we wanted to identify ourselves and let them know that we wanted to start moving forward and figure something out. So we had this nice talk with him at the town hall, and then he mentioned Dougie Bowman, who is the chairman of the selectmen at that time, and within minutes she came walking by. So we identified ourselves, and then as things developed, we decided that we were going to create an organization, the Friends of Forest Beach, and we let Dougie know that if she starts hearing things about the Friends of Forest Beach, it's us. And, we wanted something positive to happen. So we then decided, well, we don't know who else might be interested in this. This is a pretty big piece of property. And so we decided that we were going to have a meeting and see who would show up. And so we put out, press releases that the Friends of Forest Beach were going to have a meeting. It was going to be Columbus Day weekend. It was going to be at our house and the time. Well, it just happened that after we started putting out all that information, MCI WorldCom started to publicize photos of the property, saying that it was for sale for $2 million and that the Chatham Port property was sold for $4 million. And what had happened was that in September, MCI and WorldCom had merged. So an opportunity. Maybe WorldCom would answer their phone. So we prepared for this meeting, and I think people who understand how important it is to have a meeting that actually accomplishes something, it takes a lot of time to actually plan that type of meeting. And especially we were planning a meeting not knowing if anyone was going to come to it. So in the process, we had written up what we thought was a draft mission statement of Friends of Forest Beach. We also drafted a letter. At this point now, I knew who the CEO was, I knew how to reach him, and things like that. And so when we had our meeting, much to our surprise, 40 people came to our little cottage in South Chatham. And then I have to say we're off and running. And that meeting was really significant because we saw the tremendous interest, and we got the feedback. We had the mission statement, and we were rewriting the mission statement right while we were there. We drafted a letter to Bernie Evers, and literally everybody in the meeting, by the time we had finished we had a draft, everyone was in agreement in terms of every word that was going to be in that letter. And the overwhelming spirit was that, yes, we really want the land, but we really want this to be positive. We want to be nice. We want, things like that. And so we ended up sending this letter, and the letter had our mission statement, preservation of the land from Forest Beach to Mill Creek, and that we wanted a meeting with them, that we wanted them to postpone the sale of the property until we could meet, a place that would be, let's get a mutually conducive place by a certain time. And we let them know that we are serious about our pursuit of this property, and that this would be very beneficial to MCI WorldCom in terms of public relations, and that there would also be a financial benefit. Of course, we had no money, and but certainly with the spirit in the room, I think we were willing to. We would work that out. So much to our surprise, we got this letter. I faxed it to where I knew was Mr. Eber's office, and within 2 days had a phone call from his vice president of real estate. And things just began there. And so we started, talking about the land and what we wanted. And I then called Dougie Bowman, because again, it was the spirit of this was, let's get something positive moving. And the fact that they were willing to talk to a conservation group, then let's just go with it. And so we were always in touch, but very quietly, because with something like this, it could fall apart, with one wrong move. And so we started to pursue this, and by November, we had drafted a letter, Dougie Bowman to Mr. Ebers, and lined out basically everything that we had created ourselves, all the paperwork, and it was an amazing thing to be a part of. But what was so important was that those 40 people, before you knew it, we had 1,200 signatures of petitions. People were putting these petitions out, in their workplaces and businesses. Olive Cahoon in the neighborhood, who actually had seen the tower go up as a child, tended to being like the coordinator of all the petitions. A significant thing that happened at the meeting in our house was that we met Charlie Cahoon. And Charlie was like an 8th generation, family Cahoon, and he was all in on making this happen. And that was so significant to our effort to have people who had lived on the Cape for multiple generations being invested in this, because we actually lived in Connecticut and this was a second home. So, you really needed that trust when people are wanting, to preserve, land and the beach and things like that. So things just started to work out where we ended up kind of taking our lanes, and Charlie ended up being phenomenal at basically troubleshooting, and if there was a rumor that was spurring up, he would be like on someone's doorstep to try and explain it, and which, that it was a wrong rumor or whatever, and he was also fantastic with the media. So things progressed, and by December, we were having a press conference with the Board of Selectmen, and it was really good. So anyway, long story short, we ended up having a meeting with the town. It was a town meeting, and much to everyone's surprise, there was a unanimous vote of 300 people who wanted to purchase this property. The price was established because of the fact that we first asked MCI WorldCom to clean up the land and just donate it, and they said it was a hard sell. And so we really needed to help them do it. And so a price was decided, which would pay for clearing up the whole land, undeveloping it, of $950,000. We got a lot of people to go to this meeting in March. It was a special town meeting. It ended up being unanimous. There was that pause of complete silence throughout the room to see if anyone was going to object, and instead, it was unanimous, an uproar, and it was probably the shortest special town meeting. It was done in about 20-25 minutes. People were excited. And a reporter, his opening line on the article was, "You could have kept your car running." When we had the meeting before, then after that, now it was mostly out of our hands. And then when the town starts to be silent, you get really nervous. And so we had another meeting in February, and then the reporter said, "Norman Rockwell, missed a good meeting." So anyway, it was just amazing, and we really did not understand the significance. As things were rolling along, I could, a good rapport was happening with MCI WorldCom, and so I asked Dougie, if they say anything about Chathamport, do you want me to try and get that land too? And so she was like, yes, go for it. And so sure enough, that came up, and we started to get the whole deal together. And it was just really amazing, because there was just so much cooperation, so much goodwill. It's just amazing what volunteers, can do.
Marie,
So
I'm going to use your goodwill as a segue into the next section, because you've gotten us through the challenge, the David and Goliath story, to the miracle of getting the facilities and the land. And my job, by the way, is to keep everybody on time. So my responsibility is to watch Liz's face. And so we're going to move into the next step. So when you see an opportunity, what do you do? And at this point, the Chatham community spirit really kicked in terms of how to use what had become the town's possession and how to help the town, and to do it in a way that was cost effective. So for the next section about community spirit and sweat equity, we're going to have Roz Coleman, Chuck Bartlett, Bob Ryder tell us, and Barbara Cottenham, how all of that happened. How do you transform deserted buildings into something that you can use for a good purpose?
Well, I didn't go to that town meeting. I wish that I had.
Closer. Mic closer to you.
Turn the mic up.
I wish I had gone to that town meeting. I had retired, and I lived in Chatham, but I wasn't enough of a townie to actually go to that meeting. I did hear about it. And this was 1999, March of 1999. Well, sometime that year, I joined the Finance Committee. And the first thing that we did when Doug Hamilton got us all rounded up, he said, we should all know what the assets of this town are. And so we proceeded to look at everything the town owned, and one of those things was the MCI campus in North Chatham. It was a beautiful campus, but the Finance Committee didn't have any ideas either. Nobody in the town knew what they wanted to do with that property. And we didn't come up with any good ideas either. And then something happened in 2000. I think it was one of the first chronicles that came out. And it was all about the fact that there was a suicide epidemic in our town. And 3 young men had killed themselves, and they lived in our general area. And the chronicle basically said, how should Chatham respond to this? Now, that really woke me up. I had been a school psychologist for 30 years, and I knew those boys. I knew what they needed. I knew what their families were going through. So the first thing that we did when I helped get a group together, we had a suicide teach-in down at the library. And I developed an attendees response form so that I got some data from all of these people who attended. And it was so clear that these boys were isolated, and they didn't have any mentors. They didn't have any sports. They didn't have anything other than drugs and alcohol and depression. One of the boys poignantly had, after he graduated from high school, he would go see one of his school teachers. So he really wanted somebody to pay attention to him. Well, now I knew what we should do with the Marconi property. At that time, I didn't know it was a Marconi property. It was the MCI property, as far as I was concerned. And I thought that it would be a great place for adults and teenagers to interact and teach one another things, and to become mentors, and to basically have something important in their lives. So John Dixon at that time was the sailing master at Chatham Yacht Club. And for some time, he had been saying, we need community boating in this town. And so he was my first phone call. And then very shortly after that, the Chatham Yacht Club had a winter meeting. And I began to tell people that the town had no idea what to do with this new property that they owned. And I knew where the key was. I knew the person that's how I worked with the town. I knew the guy who had the key. And so I began having tours of the buildings, inviting everybody I knew to come look at these wonderful buildings. And so we began having meetings, and when Louis Masson, my next door neighbor, heard about our meetings, he came and he brought nearly everybody that he knew, which was 30 or 40 men, some of whom had worked at her station that she'd torn down. And they all they were in grief. They were totally in grief. Why did they tear the buildings down? And yes, of course, they knew what we needed to do with this operating building. We needed to restore it. We needed to bring it back to what it had been. We sort of got a little ahead of ourselves because we were brainstorming, and it made the paper that we thought, oh, maybe we could build a swimming pool up there. Okay, we were brainstorming. We didn't know that campus. And so Alan McLennan, one of my friends from the Chatham Yacht Club, also was the town planner in Arlington, Massachusetts. And he called me aside. He said, look, Roz, when you have historic buildings, you never, ever say what you're going to do with them. You just don't do that. You say you're going to stabilize the buildings. And so we had plenty of people who wanted to stabilize the buildings. And so that's what we did.
Chuck, do you want to comment on the stabilizing of the buildings?
Well, all I want to add is that,
Can you put the mic closer?
which one? This one? Like that? Can you hear me now? So we had a lot of thoughts about what to do with these buildings. Because Roz is one of those people that gets people to think about all the things that she might do. So she mentioned John Dixon, and he had been talking about community sailing for quite a long time. So he was one of them, but we also attracted Brad Pease of Pease Boat Works. And so the idea was to have a boat building program. And the idea of a boat building program and community sailing, that would go great in the powerhouse. So we were thinking about the powerhouse. And then Barbara Waters, who was on the board, and she's an educator, she liked the idea of the garage. So I don't know if you know the property, but next to the powerhouse is a small garage, and that was going to be a wet lab. And so her idea was to pump water out of Riders Cove into that building through various tanks and do wonderful things, then pump it back out again. So in addition to the operating building, where we would have a museum helped by Louis Masson, we had our eyes on the powerhouse and the garage. And that would become a problem, and I'll get to that later.
One of the people who was crawling around in the attic of the operations building was Bob Ryder. Also someone who had probably ridden his bicycle by the building as a kid.
I don't think I had a bicycle then. However, I did have family that had been in RCA for many years at that point. And the word stabilizing the building came very heavily onto me somehow. And I said, okay, I can head the crew up to do that. And we got some real good help. But most of the people are no longer with us. There are some here that were with us. I see them out there. And they were all very helpful. And because I had been commercially fishing at that time for about 35 years, I knew how to handle a paintbrush and scrape down bad paint and all that, which we did with the operating building, as it's called now. Operations building, I'm not sure which one it is. But we did that and to great success. And it went on from there. And rather than take a bunch of time, you look at some of the photos that now grace the front lawns of the two buildings there in Chatham Port, and you'll see what they look like then, and take a look now. They look a whole lot better. I'll stop right there.
Barbara, you want to talk about all of that lovely ivy?
Well, being part of the grassroots CMMC group was a natural for me because from the time we moved here in 1999, in time to vote, as a matter of fact, at town meeting, I was attracted to the North Chatham land because of the big copper beech and the linden tree and the basswood and the English oak there. I just thought they were magnificent. I wanted to know more about what in the world went on in the buildings, these beautiful buildings, and I was just very attracted to the site, and my husband can attest to that, right, John? So I considered it a town treasure. As founding members of CMMC, one of the first projects was removing ivy from the operations center. You'll see up there. And that was a huge job. So there was a big call for ladders, whoever had ladders, and volunteers. That was heard loud and clear, and amazingly enough, 7 to 8 people brought ladders, and there were people that pulled down those vines, and I don't know how they did it. It was a really rough job. But of course, being on the National Register of Historic Places, we had to be very careful of the buildings because they were latched onto the bricks and the copper, beautiful copper gutters, and so we had to be very careful of what we were doing, but we did it. We got it done. And in the background picture, you see Dick Cracer, Bob Ryder, Chuck Bartlett, and Louis Masson were some of the community-spirited volunteers who got the job done. The town helped with hauling away tons and tons of ivy. Ivy roots were dug out by Bob Ryder here, and stone was placed about 2 or 3 feet down to protect the foundation of the buildings. So it wasn't just one building. We did, a lot of the buildings were covered with ivy, so it was a huge job. So for me, that led to a quest to remove other invasive plants from the historic site on both sides of Route 28, and to improve the land so that visitors could enjoy the water views and through interpretive signs could learn about the history.
Thanks, Barbara. So now it was cleaner and it was empty, and the next step would be to actually create Chatham Marconi Maritime Center. And to explain how that worked, Roz, Chuck, and Betty Magnuson are going to fill us in on the logistics and some of the legal things that had to happen.
Well, we needed to decide, first of all, whether we would be for-profit or not-for-profit. And there were 2 people on our board who had been very successful in starting for-profit organizations. But at that time, my daughter Allison had been working for trying to organize how to fund community health centers. You may have seen an article in the paper about her doing that. And so she had developed a booklet to help not-for-profit people organize in such a way that they could make money or, basically become a not-for-profit group. So it was a big decision whether to be not-for-profit or for-profit. But then we had, and it was going to cost $60 to do the articles of organization, of incorporation. But then Fred Plum said he'd do it for us for free. And we had a booklet about how to be a not-for-profit, so that sort of it was a done deal. And then on October 7th, 2002, I got a note from Fred Plum saying that it was all done.
Which, by the way, you will notice August 21st is the day that it was signed, so that's when our 20th anniversary will happen this year.
So
Chuck.
Betty's going to...
Betty?
When all these things were going on, we were having meetings in the basement of the Methodist Church in the Sunday school rooms, and Roz was our big leader, but we had no organization. We were just working toward this project, and in getting the ivy down, we had used the 6th grade students to pull the ivy down one day as we got permission from the school. So we were just approaching it as we could. One of the members on our meeting with us was a Dr. Rigg, and he was instrumental right away to get us on the Register of Historic Places, and that became very important later on. Then we also had Dick Lumpkin, who was part of our group, Donna's father, and there was a man, Larry, and I can't remember his last name, who was also one of us meeting. And then we had to develop articles of organization. I don't know if you want to cover that part, Chuck?
Well, I think Roz just said that Fred Plum did that for us.
Yeah, and then we had creating the bylaws. If you want to mention that, or you let me do that?
What about our name? How did
And
we get
then-
our name?
Well, then we had Len, my husband, Leonard Magnuson, was the treasurer for 10 years. He no longer is with us. He's died 3 years ago. And he was able to get us as a tax-exempt organization. And then we got permission from the town to have a warrant, and they approved everything that we asked for at town meeting. Len was very vehement as the treasurer. If you wanted to spend money, you had to have very good reason. He was keeping a very tight fist on the finances because we had very little finances. And one of our big needs still is fundraising. We're managing just fine, but we're being very, very careful. You want to go up?
Okay, sure. So one of the things we wanted to do was to get approval from the town to lease the buildings was our idea. So I went and spoke to the selectmen in January of 2003, and I said, you know, we'd like to lease these buildings. Won't you issue a lease for us? And after some discussion, they decided 5-0 not to do that. So Tom Bernardo was the chairman at that point. He said, why don't you come meet with me? So I did. He had 2-hour office meetings. And he said, what you need to do is not ask for everything, but to ask for one thing. And that should be the operating building. So I went back and I said, we'd like to lease the operating building. And at that point, I got 2 yeses and 3 nos, but as the time went on, gradually got to all 5 to support it, and support an article at the town meeting in May of 2003 that directed the selectmen to issue an RFP to lease the former MCI operating building at Riders Cove in North Chatham to a not-for-profit corporation, ideally a local community organization such as the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center or other organization organized for similar purposes, for a period of no less than 10 years at an agreed-upon rate. So that was Article 43 at town meeting, and it was unanimously approved. So we were off and on our way.
But the reason that we had the article, and the reason that we had the process, is that this Alan McLennan person who had told us not to just talk about historic buildings and how we were going to stabilize them, had retired, and he lived in Orleans. And by that time, I was on the finance committee still, and I knew that the town had no idea of how to do this. And so they were going to hire a consultant And so I called Alan and I suggested that maybe he would like to be the consultant for this project. And he agreed, and so he was. We didn't have close contact during this time, of course, but he set up a process that we worked on. This is the book that we put together. He told us what we needed to do. It was a big process. All of us worked on this. And then when we turned it in and presented it to the Board of Selectmen and on 10/10/06, and then that was the beginning of really having a foot in the door. But I think that one of the things I wanted just to point out was how when I started working on this, I had no idea that Marconi had built it. And the name of the group was the Writers Cove Seaport Association. And so when Alan had said, look, these are historic buildings and you have to, treat them in a certain way to stabilize them. You don't say what you want to do with them. Well, I thought, these MCI buildings are historic. I think I'll go down and see what I can find out about them at the town annex. And so I got this little folder, and it was that the property was already in the National Register, and that Marconi had built it. That was really news to me.
And a celebration of a Marconi achievement was the next step in our story, and that was the 100th anniversary of the transatlantic transmission. And for that, we're going to turn to Reed and Jane to talk about how that operating building started to turn into something like a museum.
That's a good word, something like a museum. We call it the 10-day museum. I'm not sure quite why, because it actually lasted 8 days, but it makes it sound longer. So what started this was on Monday, January 19th, 1903. The Marconi Wireless Station in Wellfleet sent a message to the King Teddy Roosevelt sent a message to the King of England, Edward VII, congratulating him on the achievements of this new technology. So this was carried out, or we had what I call a fledgling group of citizens, which later became officially CMMC, decided to celebrate that event. Our idea was to have a temporary museum, as I already mentioned, in the wireless station built by the Marconi Company, and was right here in Chatham. The temporary museum would show off the station, which sent messages all across the world for over 75 years, a remarkable achievement. But to carry out our idea, there were several problems. Actually, there were a lot of problems. The biggest one was we had no idea how to create a museum, temporary or otherwise. So we just had to figure it out, and we would either succeed or we'd fail, but we'd try. Next, we had to get permission from the town to use the station. Louis Masson was the key person here. He stepped up to that and charmed the selectmen in a way only Louis could do, to grant us permission to use the station with water and with electricity, but no heat. The natural site for the temporary meeting was the operating building. It was a wreck because it was had been neglected for 6 years, and I think it probably had a few people exploring it, I would say, which added to the damage. So anyway, there was trash and junk to be cleaned out. In other words, the building had to be spruced up as best we could. To celebrate the transatlantic communication, we decided to open the museum on January 11th, 2003, and close it on the anniversary day, 100th anniversary day, which was January 19th, 2003. In other words, in the middle of winter. Remember, I said there was no heat. This was actually easy to solve. We just recommended that people wear coats and some of these, and maybe gloves and hats. And if you look at some of these beaches, some people, in fact, are very much covered up. And after all, there was no admission charge. So last but hardly least, we had to have exhibits. And Jane and I will now talk a bit about that.
That was my job, and I'm an art historian and worked in 3 art museums. I was way out of my field. The room was bare, except for a few radio transmitters, black boxes that don't talk to you, and there were 3 original desks, which have been refinished by the Chatham Harwich woodworkers beautifully, 1 chair and a wastepaper basket, which Lewis used. It's his wastepaper basket. That was it. What was I going to do? How could I make an interesting exhibit out of a row of black boxes on 6-foot folding tables? Just visualize that. Boring. But one of my favorite antiques we were able to find, it was nearby as it turns out, is the directional antenna. Huge antenna like this, which we placed in front of the tone rack, which is a row of, I guess you would say, radios, and we could turn the tone rack back and forth, and the students could do that. Everybody could do that and change the frequency so it could be soft and it could be louder, and they kept doing that, and it is on exhibit now. Unfortunately, you can't move it. I regret that, but I understand it. Posters. I can't say enough for posters. That is one of the posters on the wall. Is sort of turning green a little bit now, but this was suggested by Carlos Rodejo, who helped us with the architecture of the room layout, and his fiancée, Elisa and Holly Khan. Would you believe it? In 3 weeks, they made 40 posters. And it wasn't during the day, during work hours. It was after dinner, into the night. And Barbara Cottenham and John and I remember hammering one of those up at 1:30 in the morning on January 10th. And the doors opened the next day on the 11th. And there was a crowd. The posters made the whole exhibit successful. It gave a professional look to it. It almost wound around like a giant blue ribbon, tying it all together. Another part of the exhibit, I hope you don't mind if I call you an exhibit, Bob Ryder, but you are one of my pals. Anyway, he had his own cubicle set up with folding walls about where the diorama is right now, today. And he had a desk and a Morse code key and a poster beside him of the Morse code alphabet. And Barbara Waters, who's been mentioned already before, she was key in all of this, organized 4 teams of children from Chatham Elementary School to come every day for, 8 days, 10 days, and come and tap out their names in Morse code. So each child went to Bob He helped them work the key. They had a piece of paper with it on it, and each of us took, 4 of us, took the child all the way around inside the museum, all through the wooden attachment. Some of you remember that there was an extension on that, all the way back to Jamie Price, who was sitting at his station. And he said, "Hello, Mary." And she said, "How did you know my name?" And he said, "You just sent it to me by Morse code." And I don't know if any of you tried to explain to younger children about how you send messages through the air, but it's very difficult. And remember, I am an art historian. So I will now turn it back over to Reed, who, in my opinion, as a teacher, had one of the most, shall we say, popular exhibits set up, but also the scariest one, and perhaps maybe the most dangerous, the spark gap.
It was one of the most popular exhibits, was the spark gap transmitter. The technology that was used in the spark gap transmitter was used in the early experiments of Marconi. It was then used in his later experiments in Europe, and he got to his transatlantic transmissions. He used, of course, much more powerful than the little thing we had. But the point is that there was a fundamental development. It was part of a fundamental development of long-range wireless communication, and so as subject is part of that whole history. So I borrowed a small tabletop-sized spark gap transmitter, and Chuck Bartlett and Bob Raymond and I set it up. Because high voltage was involved, we set up 2 orange cones with a yellow strip.
Can you point
between
to it there? See, the only thing separating the princess
Upper right.
from the spark gap is a ribbon.
Now, there were people who worried about this. They thought maybe it was not safe. However, one of the 3 of us was always watching.
Yellow.
What?
You got a yellow sign.
Well, I got a yellow sign. Okay, don't want one of those. It was yellow tape. Anyway, there was
Finish up.
carefully watching the visitors. As it turned out, everyone survived. So last part here is part of the presentation we gave was an explanation of what a spark gap or how a spark gap worked. I don't think anybody understood what we said. However, we got their attention when the alarm came, when they set it off.
Thank you, Reed. And it's nice that there was a happy ending, that everyone survived. We're going to move into the next section based on the fact that this group had a lot of creative ideas and the sense of adventure to follow through on them. In 2003, Chuck Bartlett, at the first annual meeting of the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center, presented a PowerPoint that he shared with Liz and me a few months ago. And we thought, isn't it interesting that what's in the PowerPoint from 2003 is more or less what's in Chatham Marconi Maritime Center now? So we thought it would be a good section to kind of look at how things evolved from basically around 2003 to 2010, and we're going to look at some segments. One is the radio, amateur radio with Bob Ryder. Then the back to the museum, because it wasn't yet a museum. So how did it become the museum that you've visited in recent years with the Moffats? Chuck is going to talk about science education. And Barbara and John are going to talk about historic preservation and conservation. And then Chuck gets the heavy-duty, tough topic of funding. Because finding a way to make things happen always hinges on that. So I'll turn it over to Bob.
I'm not sure of the timing when I first set up several positions on tables like this for amateur radio operators to come in and show their metal talking around the world with Morse code, which we did on very simple tables, as I said. However, a lot of people did a lot of things to make that happen, and as usual, out of their realm or very much in their realm, depending on who it was. I'm not going to give any names because, again, a lot of them are no longer with us, but the memories are there. I just can't put a date on them. After being with this outfit for 21 years, they all blend together. So yes, amateur radio has been somewhat of a boon to Chatham Marconi Maritime Center. Sometimes more than a boon, a bellyache, I think, too. However, the way things are going, I think it's going to become much more important in the future. And rather than go deeply into the future, I'll stop right there, saying it's a wonderful hobby and a great place to do it. A lot of people are interested in it worldwide. No more from me.
Reed and Jane, want to talk about how the museum evolved?
Yeah.
I'm going to jump, well,
Wait a minute,
where are you going to start?
I'm going to start right now. I'm supposed to talk about exhibit development after the temporary.
Reed, by the way, spent quite a few years chairing the museum committee and
Well,
making things happen, with Jane in the background making things happen indirectly.
You can't walk into his office, even
Exactly.
now.
So, Reed?
Piles.
I do, you'll hear patting myself on the back about 8 years as the exhibit committee chair. But this is, little talk is going to be short because actually nothing happened about exhibit development after the 8-10-day museum. The attention turned to preoccupation, I would say, to negotiations with the town, fundraising, conservation, and other things. However, as the many obstacles began to fall away in a progress towards having a museum, I would pester Chuck, who was our president then, like, what are we going to do about exhibits? And he solved that problem by making me exhibit chairman. A job I held for 8 years. It's led to a whole bunch of meetings, and what we discovered was there were lots of ideas and lots of discussion and lots of lists, and we, however, didn't have the time or the money or the space to do all this, and we were getting sort of frozen in place, like, now what do we do? And Jane will tell you what we did.
A little bit later, Chuck said it was around 2010. I sort of remember it was a little earlier than that.
Yeah, it was.
We decided that we really needed help because there were groups among us who were vying for space. The Navy wanted space. The people who were writing about Marconi wanted space. The diorama wanted space. And then there was a group that wanted an audio-visual room. So there were all these groups that wanted space. And nobody's mentioned it yet, but the whole size is only 1,200 square feet. So how are you going to fit all this stuff into 1,200 square feet? So Chuck mentioned Wonder Cabinet, which I think is a great name. And they were in Lexington. We all went to interview them. They are exhibit designers. They are excellent. They designed one for Bunker Hill, one for Faneuil Hall. And so we asked them if they could help us. And after that, we had several meetings with them to help us ask the question, and this really sticks in my mind, what stories do you want to tell? What takeaways do you want people to come away from your museum with? And I never forgot that, and we have gone back to them from time to time. They sort of disbanded now because of COVID, which was too bad, but they really helped with the exhibit as it is today. And pretty much everybody is satisfied with their space. Navy, however, keeps wanting more.
I was just going to comment that we had a meeting, I remember clearly, in which they took all our lists and put them together sort of in a cloud. And they said, now, this is what you would like. And then they sort of drew a line through it and says, this is what you got the space for. So you decide what you want. And that was actually both practically and I think psychologically was a big boost that we had to figure out. We decided actually eventually six exhibits. And we decided, much to my displeasure, we left out science and technology, but stuck with the stories. And we actually, and this is early on, we left out kids. We figured it was hard to explain to adults about how some of the equipment works and what it's for. It becomes doubly difficult to explain it to fifth
I
graders.
see the yellow card up.
Chuck, do you want to talk about where?
I mentioned Barbara Waters. As a retired teacher, she was very emphatic about the need for education as part of the mission of the Chatham Marconi Maritime Center. And as was mentioned a little earlier, at the time when we were looking at the building, there was a wooden addition to it. It was built up during the Second World War, and it contained an office and a little meeting space. So that was our education center. And that was fine until the town got to taking a look at it in order to renovate the outside, and then they discovered there was so much rot in that wooden addition that it had to come down. So there went the education center. But Barbara was very resourceful and found ways for us to get into the classroom and found ways for students to come visit the center. And that's a model that we're using today. So we got started on the right foot. We just had a little hiccup at the beginning, and I'll talk a little bit more about the education center later.
Barbara, John?
So, a new goal for the CMMC was to educate residents and others about the station's history. And Dick Kraser wrote a community preservation grant for archiving papers, oral histories of station workers, and a video about the station. And it ended up that I did all three. Archiving involved documenting all artifacts found inside the buildings. Rose Pears helped me set up an archival system that worked. Evelyn Russ helped measure large maps and architectural drawings. There were over 100 of them. And as the first archivist for CMMC, I learned about the employees and day-to-day station work. And I was hooked on CMMC from that time on, because it was just a wonderful place during all the over 70 years that WCC was contacting all 7 Cs. Just amazing things happened. So the most challenging project of the 3, other than the oral histories, which was next, that was another challenge. Then the most challenging was the being executive director of a video, Chatham Radio, WCC, The Untold Story. And how in the world was I going to do that? But somehow everyone rose to the level of whatever had to be done. They did it. So it ended up that Walter Cronkite narrated the 16-minute video, which was absolutely amazing that we got him. And Louis Masson was instrumental in that because he knew that he was a radio man. And so John and I wrote a letter, and then I worked with his secretary many times on the phone, and finally he decided to narrate the script. And then it was, when will the script be ready? And it was like, what? CBS? I was thinking that CBS would write the script. No, the script should be ready in at least a month and a half, because we're going to overseas, because he is Walter had another issue overseas, another date. So anyway, again, rose to the challenge miraculously, and the video won 4 awards thanks to Chris Seifert, who created the video. And he just spent hours and hours and hours and all-nighters that would, because we recorded the piano music with the Congregational Church pianist, and I'd love to hear him play. So it was recorded during a snowstorm, and everything was closed down in Chatham except for Arthur McManus played the piano. He made it. Chris Seifert made it to record it, and I made it. And it was total quiet, so it was perfect. Nothing was moving, no noise at all, except for the bells, the chimes. So anyway, that was fun. And also, I arranged for Chris to go up in a helicopter to get some of the aerial photography. And that was another scene going. Anyway, I was glad when Chris came back down in the helicopter. I'll just say it was a very small helicopter, but I was assured that he had a lot of talent because he had been in Vietnam rescuing people. So surely he's competent, and he was. But anyway, it was just a fabulous thing, and I did enjoy it. Although there were times that John could tell you. There were minor emotional crises. Anyway, this video is still shown at CMMC Museum, and it's just it was a wonderful thing to be involved in that, and to be involved in the people that did all this at CMMC. Another thing that Dick thought of was the Speakers Bureau. So remember, Dick, we went to at least 20 different places, the Chamber of Commerce, promoting WCC. And Chatham Marconi Maritime Center was always on our minds. So preservation and conservation of the land was a focus of mine throughout the years. Thankfully, all of the North Chatham MCI land has been saved, so that the people of Chatham are able to access the land for water views and enjoy learning about the history through reading interpretive signs. We now have an antenna field trail that a high school student created, and that leads to the highest elevation overlooking Stillwater Pond. The amateur radio group recently created a rest area with a comfortable bench, where it's at the base of a 400-foot original Marconi-built mast antenna, and that is, the base is still there. And then sitting on the bench with an imagination, you can feel what happened, what it was like 100 years ago. And to think that through wireless communication here, breakthroughs that finally those going out to sea had a lifeline. At the Lovers Lake land has a Chatham Conservation walking trail that's across Old Comers Road, overlooking the water. And this year, work began creating Marconi RCA Park with walking trails overlooking the cove, a kiosk, benches, and a picnic table. So that was really a 20-year quest of mine, and I'll be so happy to see that when it's finished a couple of years from now. So, Michelle.
Thank you, Barb. We're going to
Okay.
move to John now.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I want to mention one person who has not been mentioned to this point, and it's Frank Messina, former Vice President and Clerk of the Works in dealing with the restoration of the operating building and the Hotel Nautilus. Now, Frank was the Clerk of the Works, which meant that he spent innumerable hours working with a contractor, that as only Frank could do. Frank would talk the contractor's language, and it's a tremendously important job for bringing. Chuck Bartlett knows, because I saw an article in the local paper where they were looking at plans. They had the blueprints for bringing back these historic buildings. So Frank Messina, Director Emeritus, my hat's off to you for doing that. And I know that time is short. I would mention Sarah Peak, and again, through Frank's influence, passed a resolution in the state legislature having to do with prevailing wage. We were not locked into paying the prevailing wage because it's a government building, and that made it happen as well. So my hat's off to Frank Messina. Thank you, Carolyn.
Chuck, you want to talk about how this all got paid for?
So once you submit a proposal, you have to say, I'm going to put up so much money in order to do the work. So our proposal that Roz showed you for the operating building said that we would raise $300,000 to do the work on the building, on the inside of the building. And that was fine, and it seemed reasonable to the town, so they said, okay. So as I looked at this, I looked at our bank balance, and although Len was very careful with the money, there wasn't much there. And I looked around at the board, and there was nobody who had any experience with fundraising, including myself. And finally, as Reed points out, we really didn't have a track record on designing and implementing a museum. And I thought to myself, who in the world is going to give us any money at all? So I said to the board, we need to have a professional come help us. So they agreed, and we found Dave Wilbur, who lives here in town. And so he agreed to give us a hand. So he went out, and we gave him a list of names, and he talked to various people and came back and said, I think you can raise $300,000. But everybody on the board will have to contribute, and you'll have to find a lead donor who will give you $75,000. Now, that's a standard fundraiser percentage. You need somebody who gives you a quarter of the total. So off we went, and the board was very helpful and contributed $100,000 towards the total. But in the spring of 2007, nobody on the horizon was going to give us $75,000. But then on one fateful evening in June, Steph and I went over to visit with John and Catherine Ryan, who live in Orleans. And I thought we were going to talk to them about making a private gift. But John Ryan had his family foundation hat on. And he said, I'll give you $75,000. And Steph and I floated home. And so we had it done. So then it was a matter of just going out and visiting people, and we ended up raising $300,000. And that was fine. And so we had the soft opening in 2010, and we had a number of exhibits around. And in came a visitor by the name of Dick Lynch. And Dick went up to the desk at the end of his visit, and Barbara Cotton was sitting there, and Dick said, "I'd like to make a donation." And Barbara knew exactly where the little forms were for people who wanted to make donations. And he said, no, I want to make a $100,000 donation. And so tell me who I need to talk to. So Barbara called me, and we got Frank and other people together and talked to Dick. And it turns out, he was with Verizon Wireless, and he was being commended by Qualcomm Corporation for the work that he'd done in getting wireless technology up and running. And the Qualcomm Corporation said they'll give, in his name, a $100,000 donation to a nonprofit of his choice. So we were his choice. And so there came the money for Reed to finish making the exhibits. And following on behind that came donations from Alcatel-Lucent and Ericsson of the same amount, $100,000 from each. So at that point, we had quite a surplus, and up came the hotel. And the town said, we want to lease that building. The hook fishermen had originally said they'd like to have it, but it didn't work out. So we said, well, there's our education center. So we made a proposal, and it was an estimated cost for doing the work, which I thought was reasonable. And the town accepted our proposal. And Frank, as clerk of the works, started working on it. And every time I had a meeting with Frank, he said, well, it's going to cost more money. And the first thing was lead paint. I want you to know that's very expensive to get rid of lead paint. And then we said, well, we need a ramp for handicap accessibility. We'll just put in a ramp and have it wrap around the building. And the town said, no, we want an elevator. And then they wanted a sprinkler system. And every time we went to the town, there was more. But fortunately, we were able to prevail upon the Community Preservation Committee and the Massachusetts Cultural Facilities Fund for gifts that were over $100,000 each. So in the end, we ended up raising over $1 million, starting out from a point where we started with not knowing what in the world we were doing. But it's worked very well. I think we've got the right set of buildings, and we've done the right things with them.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah.
And thank you all. Thank you for all you did to make Chatham Marconi Chatham Marconi. Thank you for sharing your memories with us tonight. Thanks especially to Mairead and her husband Jim for being here from South Carolina. Most people came from much closer. And it was a real pleasure to hear all of your stories. You can all see, I think, from being with us for the last hour and a quarter, how difficult it is to compress all of the information into one event. So that's how we realized we needed to have a full oral history project. We will have more panels, more programs, so stay tuned for that. The speaker series has developed a tradition of giving hats to its speakers. But if there are ever a bunch of people who already had their share of Chatham Marconi Maritime Center hats, this is it. So Liz and I thought very hard about what we could give this group to thank them for their contributions tonight and through the last 20 years. And what we are giving them is a commemorative paperweight for the 20th anniversary. So that way they can take Chatham Marconi with them, along with our appreciation. Thank you all for coming. If you have questions while we're cleaning up, feel free to corner the people who can answer your questions or share them with us and we'll follow up with the next event. But thank you all for coming.